Hey class, welcome back to Introductory Psychology. We are moving into chapter 9, motivation and emotion. And so this is kind of a combo chapter. Half of it will be looking at theories and ideas of motivation, specifically looking at a couple of things that motivate us: hunger and sex. We'll also look at some theories of motivation kind of in our everyday lives. Then we'll switch gears and talk about emotions. We'll look at the cognitive, behavioral, psychological aspects of emotions, how we express them, display rules, all those fun things. And then we'll focus on the emotion of happiness at the end. So this is, again, kind of it might not necessarily seem like these two ideas are definitely connected, but a lot of times our motivation or goes hand in hand with the experience of emotion. When you are, for example, when you are motivated, we typically feel, we feel that in terms of certain motivation or certain emotions, I should say. So, when you're really motivated to do something, maybe you feel excited, you feel interested, you feel engaged. When you feel demotivated, when you're not motivated, when motivation is lacking, you might feel or experience emotions like boredom or, disinterest, things like that. So these two topics might seem separate and they're kind of talked about separately, but oftentimes they do go hand in hand. So let's start with motivation. Motivation is just simply a force that we feel, we think, feel, and behave in a certain way that pushes us, that guides our behavior, directs our behavior. We have to be motivated to some extent in order to get out of bed every day. If we didn't have motivation of any kind, then we would just lay in bed and never do anything. So motivation, you can think about it, it's a force. It's a force that moves people. And again, I point back to, think about an experience where you felt motivated and compare that to an experience where you felt unmotivated. I mean, there's, at one point, maybe your behavior is very driven and specific and, driven by that motivation. But when you're demotivated, it's like the exact opposite. You don't have any energy or desire to do something, whatever that might be. So that motivation is what energizes, it directs, and also sustains our behavior. Sometimes things are hard. We're doing things that are difficult, like taking part in a college class. And it's not enough to just be motivated to sign up for the class, but you also have to be motivated to keep going, especially when things get difficult. So we're going to be looking at a few different theories of motivation to start. The first one is an evolutionary theory, and it really just comes down to basic human motivations tied to our instincts, like the human instinct to live. For example, we have certain instinctual behaviors that are hardwired from day one that preserve our ability to thrive and survive. For example, babies, when they're first born, if you put anything near their mouth, they will put that object in their mouth and start to suck. It's part of the natural kind of instinct to feed, to stay alive. So we don't maybe quite act as instinctually as other beings, especially beings of lower cognition, but we definitely are driven to some extent by instinct. Another particular theory, is drive reduction theory. So we have certain biological drives that we have to satisfy. So when you are thirsty, you have a need for liquids, water, or Gatorade or something or another. When you're hungry, you have a need for food. And the idea is when we experience these drives, our body kind of goes out of sync, and our motivation at this point is to return to homeostasis. So by eating food when you're hungry, reducing that drive of hunger, you're returning the body to homeostasis. Same for sleep, same for thirst. But this is really looking at some of the basic needs we have as human beings. Another theory, kind of getting into maybe some of the psychological elements of motivation, is the optimum arousal theory by Yerkes and Dodson, that each one of us kind of has a certain amount of arousal or stress that we can endure before our performance starts to suffer. So for example, imagine, if you're engaging in a task that, is pretty low demanding, you're not going to need a lot of arousal, for example, too much arousal. It's the idea is if it's a difficult task, We don't want a lot of arousal. If it's an easy task, we probably want more arousal, because otherwise we would just get bored. But if it's too difficult and we get too much arousal, too much stress, then we get overwhelmed. So we kind of have to find that sweet spot in the middle. And this curve will look different for each and every single one of us, depending on what you're referring to as motivation. Some people have a higher tolerance for stress. Some people have less tolerance. So that curve might be, might be wider, might be more narrow, depending on the individual. But these are just some of the basic theories of motivation that in psychology, are helping to understand, what motivates us as human beings at different levels. One of the primary things that motivates all beings, but especially human beings, is our hunger. We are motivated to eat pretty regularly throughout our day. We need food to survive. I mean, I think you can survive like a week without food or something like that, something pretty astounding, but it would be a very unpleasant experience. So we definitely need food. And oftentimes we experience that hunger in terms of our stomach sending gastric signals. Your stomach might start growling or contracting to let you know that you're hungry. It'll also start releasing cholecystokinin. Sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful. It's easier just to say it as CCK substance. That it's a hormone that's sit into your body. That's basically letting your body know, hey, it's time to eat. And a lot of that, honestly, is probably classically conditioned. If you're used to eating at a certain time, you might start to notice those contractions in your stomach at the same time every day. Oh, it's 11 o'clock. This is when I eat lunch. Oh, it's 7 o'clock. This is when I eat dinner. Now all of a sudden I'm hungry. Your body can actually get kind of used to that kind of time frame. Our blood chemistry is also another way we regulate, our blood sugar, specifically glucose, insulin, those levels, leptin. Those are just chemical reactions in the body, just signaling to, when we're hungry versus when we're satiated. When our body needs those particular sugars and nutrients and things to survive. So, that's one element at a very basic level, chemicals, hormones, all that fun stuff. But at the level of the brain, hunger is processed by the hypothalamus, specifically the lateral or the outer hypothalamus, which initiates for those, if it's been a while since you've read chapter 2, the hypothalamus regulates all of our basic needs as human beings, feeding, fleeing, fornicating, all those things that we need to keep the species going. So hunger and eating are part of that as well. The ventral medial inner hypothalamus regulates when we feel full, the cessation of hunger. So one part of the hypothalamus lets you know you're hungry. The other part says, hey, I'm full. So it's kind of this balancing act. We also have neurotransmitters that involved, dopamine, for example, serotonin. Like when you eat good food, when you eat food that brings you joy, brings you pleasure, like you're eating your favorite food, you're getting a nice spike of dopamine. It makes you feel good. Some people even use food and as a way to kind of psychologically, they'll use it as a way to deal with stress and anxiety and depression and things like that. And so you kind of get those boosts of neurotransmitters that might psychologically help make you feel better in that moment. Serotonin's one, dopamine, big time culprits. In America, and not just America, but America is definitely one of the more noticeable areas of concern. But we obviously need to eat to survive, but we live in a world where there's bountiful food, where people, especially in the United States, we have access to a lot of food. Not all of it's great for us. And one of the consequences to that is obesity, which means, being overweight, and then there's, there's a lot of things going into obesity. It is a biopsychosocial phenomenon. It's not just somebody is lazy and can't put the ice cream down and can't make themselves get on the treadmill. There are plenty of people who work out, and exercise and are still obese. There's a lot of things that go into it, like specifically genetics. Like if you have one parent or more who are, I'm talking about biological parents, if they are obese, that obviously would increase your likelihood as well. It's not set in stone, but it would increase the likelihood. Each individual also has, a lot of this is determined by genetics and biology, but you have a set point, a weight your body likes to be at, depending on your height, depending on your metabolism, depending on a number of factors. So, for some people, they kind of get stuck in that set point. And if you go above the set point, for example, your body might try to reduce caloric expenditure to get back down. If you go below it, your body might try to compensate by reducing energy, just how much we put out, to kind of get back up to that number. And so, you are fighting against genetics sometimes. Like if your body is kind of used to being at a certain weight and you want to get below that, you are fighting biology at a certain point, and it just adds to the potential difficulty. And that doesn't mean like you can't do it. It just means you need to be realistic about potentially, changing your weight if that's something you were concerned about. Also, adipose cells or fat cells, they are easy to put on and very difficult to take off. They're one of the most difficult kinds of cells that we, when we're trying to change our bodies in a positive way. Fat cells are some of the toughest to kind of break from. So, this doesn't mean that, biology is destiny. It's just something, again, you need to be aware of. If obesity is something you're concerned about for yourself or other people, being aware of some of these biological elements, I think, can kind of make things more realistic in terms of like approaching with an appropriate, diet, exercise routine. There are also psychological factors. For example, like I said, we live in a society where food is very abundant. Not all of that food is very good for us, but there are a lot of social kind of aspects, built into food consumption. We have gender stereotypes about food, like men are supposed to eat, steak and potatoes, and women are supposed to eat light. And, it's just weird, kind of these expectations we might have built, society, how we think, different genders should consume food. When in fact, that's probably not the healthiest approach for either side. It's like, you should just eat to be healthy, regardless if you're a male or female or not, or if you're, even if you don't subscribe to either of those genders. We also develop taste preferences, learned associations with certain foods, which have been sort of hardwired from an evolutionary standpoint across generations after generations. We also can see that in terms of like our eating behaviors can be influenced by the portion sizes. Like if you go to restaurants and they use bigger plates, and we can be influenced to eat more or eat less depending on the size of a plate. I think in this class I've had you do an assignment about that already. So it's just, it's not just like the food itself, but it's the psychology of how it's presented too, can go a long way. So portion sizes, plate sizes can matter. Also it's just really easy to just like snack and munch on things, especially, if you're maybe watching TV or you're kind of just sitting around bored. People will just mindlessly eat when they're bored. I mean, I do it too. I'm not like trying to say anything bad about it. It happens. People do it. But if you can find a way to maybe reduce that, that's a good way to maybe cut down on some of those extra calories. Be more mindful about eating, which mindful eating just simply means like being aware each time you take a bite. Like when for example, I take a drink of my coffee. I am aware, of drinking the coffee. I notice that it's, in my mouth and going down my throat. I notice the warmth in my body. I notice the caffeine kind of perking me up, things like that. But if we do the same thing for eating, if we slow eating down, that's another thing. It's not only is there just a lot of food there, but we also have a culture where it's just kind of like shovel as much food into your mouth in the quickest time possible. Think about the Nathan's hot dog eating contest. I'm not insulting that, but I'm just saying that that's like kind of built into our culture, and you can kind of see how, okay, maybe these things like obesity can develop. Be aware of calories also. The more you know about your food, specifically the calories, the sugars, the fats, I mean, all of those things, like the more of the macros you're aware of, instead of just being ignorant about those things, when you actually take the time to become conscious and aware of what you're putting into your body, you can be more mindful about how you eat as opposed to being mindless. Okay, so that's food. Another obviously huge influence of motivation for human beings is sex. We obviously need sex to reproduce and keep the species going, but it turns out people engage in sex not just to reproduce. People engage in sex for all kinds of reasons. But as a species, that's the primary reason. So from a biological standpoint, the brain is heavily involved in our motivation for sex, the hypothalamus, limbic system, cerebral cortex, a lot of the things we've talked about in previous chapters, temporal lobes. We also have sex hormones, estrogens, androgens, testosterone. I mean, these are things that, these are things that lead to sexual maturation. Doesn't, just because you are sexually mature physically, obviously doesn't mean psychologically you are, but these are the kind of chemicals, the hormones at work that are playing in. Again, serotonin, dopamine, those neurotransmitters kind of involved in that urge, reward, relief cycle. Those are also involved. So some similar culprits: dopamine, oxytocin. Oxytocin is a hormone neurotransmitter. When you physically embrace somebody, like hug somebody, or if we're talking about sex, you're probably doing something more than hugging, but produces oxytocin, produces that feel good chemical when we're physically embraced by somebody else. The body actually undergoes a unique stage or response when you're engaging in sex, whether it's by yourself or with somebody else. The body will physically go through 4 unique stages as identified by William Masters. And I want to say his research partner, Johnson, but I don't remember her first name, so I apologize. But initially we go through the excitement phase, and this is where you become physically aroused. Like maybe you notice you're attracted to someone or something, again, I don't want to speak about anyone's sexuality, but these things are happening whether you're with somebody else or you're having sex by yourself. So becoming physically excited, physically aroused, now sex is happening, and this is kind of the plateau phase of that excitement. Like you've reached the peak of your excitement after a certain period of time, after, from sexual activity, then the individual or individuals will reach orgasm. And then afterwards, for men specifically, you have this resolution phase or the refractory period where you have to wait a certain period of time to have another orgasm and keep that cycle going. The same thing doesn't apply to women or females, excuse me. This half year is kind of exclusively for men. What's really interesting is like this pattern was discovered, physiologically, biologically by Masters and Johnson in the 1950s. They just simply studied people having sex. They hooked them up to EKGs and all these different machines and just took biological data about what was happening, and they identified this cycle. And again, it's happening whether or not you're having sex by yourself or with another person. But this is stuff that was discovered 70 years prior, at a time when we were a pretty prude nation. And I guess to some extent we still are, but it's pretty interesting if you kind of dig a little deeper into the researchers themselves. It's just a pretty interesting story. Okay, so cognition is involved as well. It's not just a physical, psychological. Sex is more than physical; it's more than psychological. There's cognitive capacities. Obviously, like we think about people enter puberty in their teenage years, in which puberty is just meaning your body is physically capable of having sex and reproducing children. But that doesn't mean you are cognitively capable. That's why we have laws in this state, in this country, that you cannot enter into sexual relationships with people under a certain age because they're cognitively not, capable of making those decisions. Once we reach adulthood, I believe, I think in Oklahoma it's under 18 or something. I want to say it's like 16, which is kind of weird to hear. Maybe I need to look up that and find out for sure, but I want to say it's 16, but in most cases it's 18. But even then, there's probably a lot of evidence to suggest even someone 18 may not be cognitively capable of, entering into those kind of relationships. I mean, there's a lot of research that would suggest, one way or the other, I suppose. So that's one issue. That's why this idea of like consent is becoming so much more important. We want to make sure people are cognitively aware of what they're doing, like, before they enter into, sexual relationships. We also have sexual scripts, like basically ways that we assume we are supposed to act when it comes to sex. Some of that can be influenced by culture, media, things like that. Some of those standards are incomplete, depending on our background, our exposure to models and people who, show us about sex, teach us about sex, things like that. There's also double standards. For example, like if men go out and have sex with lots of women, they're considered like, they're held in high esteem by their male counterparts. They're high-fived and it's a great thing. But if a woman goes and does the same thing, she might be looked down upon by her peers, might be considered, might be given, might be labeled for that particular behavior in a, really in a not good way. So definitely there are double standards that exist when it comes to sex. Also, interpretation of a sexual event, like you have to cognitively think through a situation. Oh, is this person attracted to me? And are they initiating are they initiating a sexual event? And are both parties and, interpreting and initiating the right thing? You could be trying to initiate that and it goes over someone's head and they don't interpret it that way, or vice versa. So it's, there are things happening between the ears that are influencing, whether or not we engage in sexual activity. And again, affirmative consent, that is like the number one thing. We want to make sure that like the sex that is happening, it's between two consent. If it's happening with more than one person, it's consensual. And cognitively, the person making the consent is capable of making the consent. I mean, that's why like it's a terrible idea to try to after somebody try to get consent with somebody who's consuming alcohol or drugs or things like that. Maybe they do say yes, but they're not in their cognitive capacity to know better, perhaps. So that's why it's a really, that's a really slippery slope. And I would be very, very careful about that, mixing, alcohol and substances and things like that. And yeah, it's just not a good recipe. Okay, what other factors influence sexuality? We have different cultures, for example, who, refer to sex, I think our idea about sex and sexuality is constantly evolving, especially in the United States. It's a topic that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, but, I think we're becoming more and more open to it. But there are different cultural perspectives and different ways of thinking about sex outside of the standard Western kind of definition. So if you want to jump into your King textbook and read about a couple of these examples, these are some fascinating kind of case studies about differences in sexuality in terms of cultural approaches. So take a look at that. In the United States, we also have, we have sex education. A lot of children, are supposed to learn about sexual activity through sex education, but to be honest, that is a losing fight at this point, because I think people are learning about sex and from other places besides sex education. If your experience of sex education was like mine, I had a awkward gym coach come in and teach my class all about sex, and they used a really old presentation, and it was like incredibly awkward for the presenter and for us. Like it felt like we were, being taken back to the 1950s and being taught, I'm sure it's changed since then, but I think, sex education, of course, there's a lot to be desired in terms of, if the goal is delay sexual activity and reduce teen pregnancy, I mean, those are the explicit goals, but there's a lot of evidence that shows that, by the time individuals are 17, they've probably already had sex. I want to say the majority, it's probably over 50%, maybe even higher, have had sex by then. So there are different types of sex education. There's comprehensive, which teaches about contraceptive use, teaches about STIs or STDs, sexually transmitted infections, diseases. But the most funded method for sex education is abstinence only, which is kind of like putting your head in the sand as an ostrich and pretending like things don't happen. I'm sure that would be nice if that was the goal, but turns out people have sex. Even if you preach abstinence only, people still have sex. Teenagers still have sex. So, there's a lot of evidence that shows that comprehensive is more effective, but doesn't get as much funding as it should. Okay, so sexual behavior, we've spent this whole time talking about the motivations behind sex, but it really sort of begs the question of, well, what is sex? What constitutes sex? I mean, there's all kinds of questions you might have to ask. Are we specifically talking about vaginal intercourse? Well, if that's the case, that's ruling out a lot of people. If we're only talking about vaginal intercourse, I mean, there's a whole lot of people engaging in, sex that are not doing that. So maybe we need to expand the definition. Does it incorporate activities involved in reproduction? Well, again, I mean, that probably speaks to a lot of people engaging in sex, but I mean, if you are a gay or lesbian couple, LGBTQ couple, then you're perhaps not engaging in those aspects related to reproduction. So, probably need to consider more options or consider more expansive definition. Arousal and sexual response, perhaps, and each of these sort of will exclude some people in some activities. So that kind of that the definition, if we look at it very narrowly, just doesn't necessarily encompass the full spectrum of human sexuality. So really a more broadly a way of understanding it is behaviors that are specific to each individual that lead to pleasurable, usually intimate and personal experiences. So that doesn't necessarily have to involve vaginal intercourse, doesn't necessarily have to lead to reproduction, or even arousal and sexual response, like we talked about with the 4 phases earlier. Those things are, typically included, but not always. So we have to be really careful. In this case, we're talking about a very broad definition of sex. We know a lot about sex from researchers who've tried to study it. Specifically, Kinsey surveyed people, just people in general, about their sexual behaviors, sent out multiple surveys, but some of those studies took place in the 1940s. And some of the findings, showed that, the frequency of sex, it's declining. Unmarried individuals are reporting having more sex than married individuals. Sexual satisfaction matters to relationship satisfaction. Makes sense. I mean, if that's a huge aspect of your relationship, dissatisfaction there could potentially lead to dissatisfaction in the overall relationship. Some gender differences. When it comes to consumption, when it comes to sexual behaviors, men tend to engage in masturbation more often, meaning having sex by themselves. They tend to view more pornography, report engaging in casual sex more often, and typically have more permissive attitudes. Again, these are only self-reports. So, this is the difference between what people report and what people actually do. There could be some discrepancy. In fact, we'd probably predict that, but just as an overall trend, these are the findings. Men tend to be more focused than women on physical needs, not just sex. Women tend to show more changes in their sexual partners and desires over the course of the lifetime. What about sexual orientation? The direction of our sexual interests, and that's not just sexual behavior. It's in terms of who you are attracted to, and we are understanding that it is becoming more fluid, more of a continuum, just like gender. You can be heterosexual, meaning you are attracted to the same or the opposite gender, excuse me. So if you're male, you're attracted to females. You can be gay or lesbian, which means you're attracted to the same. Bisexual, attracted to both. Pansexuality, attracted to pretty much anything and everyone at that point. Pretty much open to all kinds of things. And then asexual, not being sexually attracted to anybody. And again, it's very much a continuum. It's the more we understand about gender, the more we understand about sexual orientation. We understand that those things are just not black and white. They're not this or that. There's more fluidity to them. Here's what we know about sexual orientation. It is not influenced by your parents' sexual orientation, their parenting styles, engaging in any kind of sexual experimentation. It's also not a choice. It's not a choice. And we know it's not a choice because heterosexuals don't make that choice. Nobody is like coming up with like a pros and cons list and going, okay, should I be gay? Should I be straight? Should I be bi? No, it's you are attracted to who you are attracted to. We do know that sexual orientation is influenced by genetics, hormones, and potentially some psychological factors, but we can really point definitively to biological factors, and it is not something that is chosen. It is not something you choose, regardless of your orientation, you do not choose it. And it is a big part of an individual's identity. It's a huge part of people's identities. And I think people who are heterosexual have the kind of benefit of you live in a culture that is primarily and dominant. Heterosexuality is the dominant sexual identity. So it's something you don't even necessarily have to think about. But if you're someone who is outside of that, that kind of majority orientation, then you have to think about those things. And it becomes maybe even a bigger part of your sense of self, your sense of identity. Oops, sorry. Skipped over 2 slides, my bad. Here we go. And so some also, kind of related to this idea of sexual orientation, there's a lot of concerns, or have been concerns previously, that, children, I think there's still concerns that people have that, children should be raised in a home with a mom and a dad, traditional nuclear family. But there's a lot of evidence that shows that children who are raised by gay men, lesbian women, they are just as well adjusted. They do just as fine in life as their heterosexual counterparts. They're no more likely to be gay than somebody who, grows up in a heterosexual household. They're no less likely to be accepted by their peers, that they're not going to be made fun of. You might think that might be the case. So there's a lot of evidence that shows that marriage equality, when we support marriage equality, not just, the traditional nuclear family, it supports the well-being of the individuals, the couples, and their children. So this is something I think that, if you're not aware of, marriage equality was, it was enacted by the Supreme Court in 2015. I'm recording this video in 2022, so it's really only been around for 7 years legally in the United States, as in the entire nation. I think a few other states like Hawaii and have tried to do it beforehand, but this is something that took a lot of time and a lot of fighting, legally, otherwise. And the evidence shows it's beneficial for all parties involved. So now we're switching gears back to some more theories of motivation. Another one of those theories that probably should be familiar by now is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I think we talked about this in a previous chapter, at least introduced it, but here it is again. It's basically we have certain needs, a sequence of needs that have to be met. We need to meet our basic needs before we can meet the higher ones on the hierarchy. But the goal of this theory, or the motivation behind this theory, is we are attempting to achieve self-actualization, reaching our fullest potential as a human being. This is a humanistic theory. It's a very optimistic about human beings. We're all capable of achieving that potential. But here's the hierarchy. Here's the pyramid that Maslow came up with, probably culturally appropriated from indigenous native tribes, but that's for another PowerPoint. So according to Maslow, we have to meet our physiological needs. We have to have food, water, things like that. Then we need to feel safe. We need to have needs of safety met. So having, shelter over our head, clothes on our back, things like that. Then once we've satisfied those needs, we need to satisfy the needs of love and belongingness, like having quality relationships, romantic, platonic, etc. Then we need to feel good about ourselves, feel esteem. And once we've established those goals, we've met those needs, according to Maslow, we become self-actualized, or we are capable of becoming self-actualized. Not everybody is self-actualized. In fact, I think Maslow kind of thought that was a rare experience for a lot of people. Another theory is self-determination theory by Ryan and Deasy. Ryan and Deasy talked about we have 3 basic needs as human beings. We want to feel competent, meaning we feel capable. We have high self-efficacy in certain areas. We want to feel relatedness, meaning we belong and feel good and warm, and have friendships and relationships with other people in a warm way. And then autonomy, meaning we can make choices for ourselves. We're independent, we're self-reliant. So when competence, relatedness, and autonomy are met, that's when that is kind of the peak of our motivation. That's when we're capable of being our best selves, so to speak. Another area of motivation that's important to distinguish is the difference between intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is the motivation that comes from within. Extrinsic motivation is motivation that's external to you. For example, you might take this psychology class because you just simply want to learn about psychology. You enjoy the subject of psychology. You have this intrinsic need to learn about psychology. Extrinsic motivation might be some kind of incentive, reward, or punishment, perhaps. Maybe you want to do well in this class because you want to get a good grade. You want that good grade on your transcript, and you want to get a good job, and you want to get a degree, and all of those important things, those more extrinsic goals. There's a lot of evidence that shows that intrinsic motivation, we need both. To some extent, we do need both, we experience both, but there's a lot of evidence that shows that extrinsic motivation actually can be undermining. If there's something you just truly love to do, maybe let's say you like to paint and you really enjoy it. It brings you peace. It brings you calm. You enjoy making art. But your relationship might change to that if all of a sudden people were paying you, yeah, it's nice to get paid. It's nice to get paid for that money, but maybe instead of doing art on your time and the art you want to do, now you're doing the art somebody else wants to do, and it's on their time. And so, that could lead to potentially, maybe not liking it as much. So both motivations usually kind of involve some element of both, but intrinsic appears to be the sweet spot. Another area of motivation, one of the more difficult ones, I think, when it comes to human beings is our ability to self-regulate, our ability to control our own behavior, to control behavior, especially when it comes to trying to achieve important objectives, like setting goals for yourself. For example, like if you want to lose weight, you want to get better, you want to get in better shape. You have to self-regulate your behavior to being, okay, I'd rather be sitting on my couch watching Netflix right now, but guess what? I need to go to the gym and get on the treadmill and run or do something like that instead. Self-regulating goes hand in hand with goal setting. In order to set goals too, I think it's important to have goals that are specific. So not just saying, hey, I want to be in better shape, but say, hey, I want to lose 10 pounds. I want to gain 10% muscle mass compared to what I have now. I mean, be as specific as possible. It needs to be a goal that is moderately challenging, meaning it can't be too easy and it also can't be too difficult. If it's too easy, then why set the goal? If it's too difficult, it's just going to frustrate you and you're not going to accomplish your goal. But it needs to be kind of that sweet spot where it's challenging enough, but not too challenging. Has some kind of long-term purpose. It's not just, hey, I want to lose 5 pounds so I can look good this summer. Maybe it's, I want to lose 5 pounds so I can start, living a healthier life. I can take some of the stress off my body by walking around at a lower body weight. And that just kind of makes my life in general more easy. And it sets me up for long-term success in terms of health. Short-term accomplishments are good too, but it's good to balance it out, have both long-term and short-term goals. The short-term progress accomplishments will kind of motivate you and keep you directed towards those longer-term goals. Okay, that's it for motivation. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about emotion. And emotion, we're getting into the feels. We're talking about affect. We're talking about, it's a physiological response. But emotions involve a physiological feeling or physiological arousal, I should say, conscious cognitive experiences, and behavioral expression. So there are 3 parts to any emotion. So when you're happy, for example, you might feel a certain way. You might feel excited. You might feel good about yourself, physically good. You might have a lot of happy thoughts like, oh, I'm really happy today. I'm enjoying my life. I like these things. And also behaviorally, you might have a smile on your face. We wear those feelings those emotions on our sleeves or on our faces. So it's part physiological arousal, meaning, our emotions oftentimes are the reaction to things. And this is regulated by the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system specifically arouses, whereas the parasympathetic nervous system calms us down. So for example, like the emotion of fear, if you step outside after listening to this lecture and you open your door and there's a vicious snarling dog, for example, that fight or flight kind of fear emotion would come over you via the sympathetic nervous system. Maybe after you go inside and have a chance to calm down for a minute, take some deep breaths, then you have the parasympathetic nervous system kicking in. So this is just a natural response. Emotions are a natural response, specifically, especially the fight or flight response, which we've talked about in previous chapters. Sympathetic nervous system sends us into fight or flight with all of these different changes happening here. Parasympathetic, sends us into rest and digest, and the opposite happens here. Okay, so how do we measure arousal? When we say arousal, we're just talking about emotional arousal. One of the ways we do so is through polygraph tests, which measure things like heart rate, breathing, skin conductivity, meaning like, are you sweating on your skin, the galvanic skin response. And you compare those to neutral versus target questions. You might ask a person, okay, is your name such and such? That's a neutral question. And then you might ask a few of those just to get that baseline measurement of how their physiological reactions are happening emotionally. But then you might jump into target questions. If this is for law enforcement purposes, you might ask questions of interest. If it's for a job, you might, things like that. However, these are used often, but there's not a lot of research that shows they actually are reliable in terms of detecting deception. Because sometimes people just get nervous, physiologically nervous, and even when they're not lying, just simply being questioned, like simply being hooked up to a machine, and being asked personal questions might make somebody nervous, even if they're not lying. So there's really not, these are, and some, I want to say in some countries, they're just like flat out banned in terms of evidence. I think in the United States, we still, to some extent, allow these as admissible, but they're, you have to be pretty careful, in terms of like the criminal justice system. There's also the Polygraph Protection Act. A polygraph test can be used, but I think they have a very limited scope of how they can be used in terms of employment, criminal proceedings, things like that. In terms of emotions, how we experience emotions, there are a few different theories. The first, probably the most original theory when it comes to emotions, is James Longa theory from William James, and I want to say James Longa. The idea behind this theory is we see a stimulus that induces emotions or stress, perhaps. This produces a distinct physiological arousal. And those changes in physiology are what we experience as an emotion. So maybe you're walking in a field, you see a bull potentially charging at you, I guess. That would be pretty scary. All of a sudden, your heart starts to race. Therefore, you're experiencing the emotion of fear. Compare this to cannon barred, where we see the stimulus. However, these are not distinguished as two events. These things happen simultaneously and independent of each other. So that's the big difference, is kind of the arranging of the squares. All the same squares are there, but how they're arranged is a little bit different. So Cannon Bard says these things are happening simultaneously as opposed to two separate events. Other factors that might be involved in emotion, neurotransmitters, dopamine, endorphins are typically associated with positive emotions. Norepinephrine, noradrenaline, sometimes referred to, is usually associated with negative emotions like arousal, anxiety. Low serotonin, we know that correlates with anger, aggression, other negative emotions. The amygdala is also involved in both positive and negative emotions, specifically fear. So biologically, a lot of the same culprits we've talked about in previous chapters are coming up again and again, but now in the context of emotion. And fear is a specific emotion that is of interest. There are two kind of pathways when it comes to fear. You have the direct route, the quick route, which is, visual. It's from the eye. We see something stressful. We see something that induces fear. That information travels, through the thalamus to the visual cortex, direct path, but the indirect path much more detailed. And this is for example, like we need both of these. We need both of these pathways to perceive fear. The direct path, like if you're walking in the woods and all of a sudden you see a snake, your brain reacts very quickly in that direct route. You don't need a lot of time to process that information. Your brain knows, oh heck, that's a rattlesnake. It could bite me. And sometimes we do that even if there's not a rattlesnake there. You might, see something that kind of out of the corner of your eye that looks like a rattlesnake, and all of a sudden it's really just like a garden hose. It's dirty and, tangled up or something. But your brain very quickly would send you into that fight or flight. The indirect is much more, like it says, indirect. There's more cognition behind it. So, maybe at first you startle, you think it's a snake, and you're like, I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure if it is. But upon further inspection, oh, it is a snake. Okay. So maybe in that case, you're using both the direct and indirect route. But we are programmed very, from a lack of a better term, genetically, biologically, however you want to say it, we're sort of programmed to respond to fear-based stimuli. So the indirect might, not only is it, the indirect, maybe you don't even have to have a snake around. Maybe you just think back, oh my gosh, that time I almost stepped on a snake and got bit. That emotional memory might jar up that experience again, taking, that indirect path and evoking the experience of fear. Another theory of emotion is the two-factor or the Schachter-Singer theory, which says we see an external stimuli, we see the bull, we experience physiological arousal, but we also have this element of cognitive labeling. We interpret the physiological arousal. Oh, my heart is beating really fast, therefore I must be afraid. I saw the bull, my heart's racing, therefore I must be afraid. We as human beings label that experience cognitively. So other factors in emotions, physiological arousal, conscious experience, behavioral expressions, which comes first? So there's still this kind of debate, which comes first, feeling or thinking? Lazarus, for example, would say appraisal is what determines feeling. So thinking comes first. Like do we appraise the situation as stressful or not? If it's stressful, do we have the resources or not? So Lazarus would point to thinking before feeling. whereas maybe as a junk says there's really no preferences in terms of that goes. They don't need any kind of inferences, no thinking necessarily involved. So emotions can happen without thinking. But probably the answer is probably both. We need a little bit of both. There are times that emotions are preceded by thinking, and other times not so much. The last factor in terms of emotion is behavioral. We express those emotions, whether it's verbally, like you might just tell somebody, I'm angry, I'm happy, I'm sad. All those different ways we might verbally express it. There's nonverbal, your facial expressions, your posture, your gestures. If you're slumped over and you've got your arms crossed and you've got a scowl on your face, most people can probably determine, oh, that person is mad, that person is sad. But if you're kind of, you're relaxed and your arms are open and you got a smile on your face, people can read that. They can say, oh, so-and-so's happy. They're feeling good. There's some interesting stuff about emotions too. There's this idea of the facial feedback hypothesis where the emotions we wear on our face can actually influence the emotions we experience. So for example, if your mouth is in the muscles of your mouth are shaped like a smile, that's sending signals from the muscles in your face to your brain. And your brain, after a certain period of time, starts to interpret that. It's like, well, my face is in a shape like a smile, therefore I must be happy. And there's some really fascinating research that kind of shows this, where individuals were asked to read funny comic strips, and they were either asked to hold a pencil in their mouth like this, because that evokes a smile or similar to a smile, or hold a pencil in their mouth, or an object in their mouth like this, which is more like a frown. And what they found is the individuals who had their face shaped like that, like a smile, rated the comics to be funnier. They had more enjoyment from reading the comics. And this idea is it kind of supports this James Longa theory of emotions, that physiological arousal is definitely involved in emotions, and how that experience of those changes can have a profound impact on our emotions. So test yourself. Can you identify the following emotions? I'll just kind of click through these slowly. You can pause as needed. Here we go. Next one. Happiness, anger, sadness, surprise, disgust, and fear. These are the universal emotions that as human beings, we are ready to express from day one. As soon as we are born, we are hardwired in a sense to express emotions this way. For example, a child who is born blind, they will smile when they're happy. Even if they've never seen a smile before, they will, frown and cry when they're sad. They will, they'll open their eyes really wide when they're surprised. We see these emotions expressed by other people in their faces, but we don't necessarily have to learn them. They are essentially hardwired. They are part of the basic human experience. Other factors, sociocultural factors when it comes to emotions, that's really getting into, typically emotions like happiness for the most part is considered, if you put a smile on your face, universally people are going to understand, oh, you're happy, regardless of where you go in the world. But it's really interesting in the sense that those display rules do vary across cultures. You might understand what that person has experienced based on their facial expression, but the rules themselves will be differently across cultures. I think about the United States. Like I'm in Oklahoma right now. And if you're, walking in a store, walking down the street, whatever, and if you smile at a stranger, wave at them, whatever, they're probably going to return it in kind. They'll smile back and, how's it going, and move on. But let's say you're in New York City and you're walking downtown in Manhattan and there's all these people around, and if you stop and smile at somebody and wave at them, hello, a stranger, they might like, what are you doing? You're crazy. Like, why are you smiling at me? Like, what do you want from me? They might interpret it totally differently because there's just a different kind of cultural expectation of display rules, even within our same country. So, you can imagine what that might be like from country to country. For the most part, there's a lot of similarity, but the time and place of when emotions are expressed can vary quite a bit across different cultures. Some gender differences. Men and women are alike in terms of the way they experience emotions, use similar facial expressions, adopt the same kind of language. They'll describe their emotions, similarly. However, the differences might emerge in terms of women are more likely to report their feelings, especially of sadness and anxiety. Men are more likely to report anger and irritability. But it's important. It's not just because you're a man, you do this, or because you're a woman, you do this. Like, there are other contexts that have to be taken into consideration, social context specifically. Okay, we can also, in terms of emotions, they are defined and classified in terms of their valence, meaning are they positive or negative? Happy we would consider a positive emotion, negative we would consider or sadness would be considered a negative emotion. They're also classified in terms of arousal. Is the emotion more activating, more engaging, or is it more passive versus calm? And so you can kind of create a continuum for that. So for example, if the emotion is high in valence, positive in valence, but high in arousal level, we might describe it as ecstasy. I mean, you feel great, you feel fantastic. But if it's the opposite, if it's negative and it's low, it might be considered boredom. So kind of depending on where you fall under one of those two classifications is a good way of thinking about how to describe your own emotions. And this is what this might look like, more fleshed out, kind of taking that 2x2 matrix and making it into a full on, it looks more like a XY axis you might see in math, but with emotions. So we have valence on the x-axis, we have arousal on the y-axis, and depending on where you fall, you might experience any number of these emotions listed here. Emotions are important in terms of our ability to survive and keep the species going. They're adaptive. Negative emotions, for example, are suggestions to us that we need to take immediate action. If you're sad, if you're depressed, that's a lot of times it's like, oh, what am I sad about? What am I depressed about? I need to do something about that. If I'm angry, I need to take action. I need to, stop this, whatever's making me angry, whatever's making me sad. Positive emotions are used to some extent to help us bond, broaden, and build relationships with other people, according to Fredrickson, which also might be related to this kind of the family tree model, where we have root, trunk, branches, and leaves kind of all built in. You have the root is our brain's reward system, the natural way we respond to pleasurable experiences. The trunk is the enthusiasm, the positive emotions. The branches are the neurotransmitters, serotonin, oxytocin, dopamine, and the leaves themselves are kind of, so it's really showing you how deep and embedded this experience of emotion and expression of emotion is cognitively, psychologically, etc. And then our ability to express resilience, especially, when we encounter stressful events, being resilient towards that stress can help create more of a positive outlook on life and develop what is known as emotional wisdom or emotional intelligence. Okay, one of the last things we're going to look at is the topic of happiness. I think it's the emotion that gets probably the most attention in society. We think about how do we become happy? How can we stay happy? Happiness is a biopsychosocial event. It's influenced by genes. It's also influenced similar to our own weight. We might have a set point. Some people might be happier than others. Some people might be unhappier than others. There are certain obstacles that might get in the way, what's considered being on the hedonic treadmill, where you're just engaging in pleasurable things that you think make you happy, but really they're only done so in short term. Like sometimes people will buy things for themselves because they think it'll make them happier. I'm going to go buy a new cell phone, a new car, or whatever. And it might make you happier for a moment, but probably that high of the new purchase will come down and eventually you're like, oh, well, I need to go buy something else to feel, so you can kind of get stuck in that kind of loop or that treadmill. Direct pursuits of happiness can backfire sometimes, like trying to be happy. It makes it even more difficult. It's like for some reason, we're happiest when we're not trying, when that's not the explicit goal, it just kind of comes easier. When it comes to happiness, activities, things like that, to optimize your ability to enjoy happiness, to get the most payoff from it in terms of setting goals. You want to set goals for yourself that are important and personally meaningful to you. So it's not just, oh, I want to pass this class because my mom wants me to. It's like, oh, I want to do it because it means something to me. I want to feel good about myself. Getting an A in this class would make me feel good about myself. reflect back on the intrinsic needs, competence, autonomy, relatedness, from the self-determination theory we talked about, having goals that are moderately challenging, that aren't too easy, but aren't too difficult, things that we can realistically accomplish. And that's kind of maximizing the potential from happiness. Goals also, keep us more positive, experiencing more positive emotions consistently, keeping us interested, and it's okay if your goals change, if they evolve, they adapt, that's okay, because as life happens, our goals happen. But there's something to think about in terms of your own happiness. So that's going to be it for chapter number 9. Man, we're over halfway through the course. We'll jump back into chapter 10. Let me know if you have any questions, any concerns. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye.